Hey, everybody. Um, Welcome. It is Tuesday night. If you're around, feel free to jump in the chat, but I'm probably going to ramble on for a little bit here. I'm actually going to try to do two videos tonight, so you're in luck. Um, because I got two pretty interesting comments today to older videos. And to me, it's just easier to make a video rather than typing out responses to a lot of the comments. Mainly because I don't want to. This is the INFJ FE thing, right? I don't want to come across as like you know mean or snarky or anything like that. And I think typing out responses just sort of naturally lends to that. And I want to address all the comments, in good faith, and invite anybody who, wants to talk about it. I'm happy to discuss live or, in a recorded video or whatever. So reach out to me. My email should be available on the about page. So that being said, and then plus, like, I can't fit everything I want to say into written comments, of course. So, okay. So the first one I want to address, where is it? Bear with me here. Okay, and then also let me preface this: like, if I'm reacting to your comment and you don't want me like blasting you out on the internet or drawing attention to you, um, then certainly let me know, and I will remove the video or whatever. Okay, I'm trying to find it. Okay, here it is. Okay, so this is a comment from Lava Peak Bengals 7723. So this was in response to my Elon Musk ISTJ video that I sort of tongue in cheek put "don't at me," because I knew I was going to get added about this. So here it is. So getting called to the carpet. Okay, so I'm going to read the comment and then I'm going to react. And I think it's a good comment here, and I think there's a lot to talk about. So it starts off, okay, so I actually like you. I like you too. And think you do a great job of explaining things you've learned. Okay, so we got probably have enough here. Um, that being said, Lyndon Barons, with the help of Dario Nardi, blah, 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 developed a system for typing based on 6 separate metrics. And if you learn those, you'd be able to tell that Elon is informative, which rules out all of the TJs. He's also a control type, which would rule out the IXTJs. So ISTJ, was my typing of him. And then it goes on to say all NTs are systematic and therefore they'd explain things the way you talk about. Okay, so I think the conclusion here is that he's some NT type, but not an INTJ, and maybe not even an ENTJ. And so I guess I would leave ENTP or INTP. But I, don't want to put words in anybody's mouth, but that's what I'm concluding. But really the main point here, though, is not really to get into it of whether or not Elon Musk is an ISTJ or what, like, honestly, like I really don't have a dog in that fight, and it's certainly open to interpretation, and I'm the first one to say, without actually putting the guy through some sort of test or inventory or whatever method you want to use, we're all just throwing darts, right, and just making guesses. Now, of course, we'd all like to assume we're making educated guesses, but we are making guesses. And I'll also be the first to admit that, when you when I do those sorts of things where I'm like, oh yeah, Bill Gates is a such and such, and The Rock is an ENFJ, and all that, and Joe Rogan is an ESFJ, all that kind of stuff. I'm really just, um, trying to make the data fit the theory, right, rather than the theory fit the data. And I'm perfectly aware of that, and that's fine. That's what we're all doing, and that's all part of the fun of it. Unless you're actually doing like the real testing. Um, so, but I want to talk about this is more of a prompt. Again, it's not sort of an argument about who's right and who's wrong. He could be ENTP, INTP, sure. Um, but more about just sort of the different frameworks, because some of you might be new and haven't seen other videos. They're buried somewhere where um, I sort of explain the framework that I use. And I'm definitely aware of Nardi and Linda Barron's and their work that they've done over the years. But they have a very different framework, and that's sort of what I want to get into. So with Linda Barron's, I mean, she's been around for a long time, been a very big figure in this. And even when I was in grad school, she was a big name out there in what we would call IO, or industrial organization. And that's an important point, is that there's a whole branch of psychology that focuses on sort of human resource type things. Like we would call it industrial organization. Other schools might call it something else. But it's more about group dynamics. I always sort of compare it to sort of figuring out which Hogwarts house you're in, right? It's sort of a sorting mechanism. Like, are you a Slytherin, or are you a Ravenclaw, or whatever, whatever the names are, right? And that's fine, it's a very applied use of typology, and but it's going at it from a very different angle than I might be going at it from, and others that I frequently cite, because they're looking at it from sort of a interaction style, and how does your personality, as assessed on the MBTI and various other inventories that they've got, where do you fall sort of in the organizational hierarchy, so to speak, right? And are you this type of worker, or are you that type of worker? Are you sort of a person who shuts the door and just wants to do their work and not be interrupted in your office? Or are you the type of person who's always hanging out by the water cooler and trying to get everybody jazzed up about the next big company project, right? That kind of stuff. And they'll pretty much use the MBTI as sort of a baseline, right? So they're sort of taking whatever you come out on through the MBTI as a given, right? And I've got plenty of other videos of why that's somewhat problematic, of just sort of assuming, whatever you get on the MBTI is just sort of a given. But if you're doing academic research and you're doing this sort of applied use, like, you have to just, accept that, right? It's a very TE versus TI kind of thing. You just have to accept, like, okay, this thing isn't perfect. The Hogwarts sorting hat might not be perfect, but it does good enough for government work, right? Or it does, well enough in a pinch, because if we are constantly bickering about the defined terms and everything, then we can't really do, accomplish what we're trying to accomplish. And so Barron's done, over the years, she's done a great job. She's got lots of different frameworks out there. She calls lenses. And but it's in that sort of field, right? The IO, industrial organization, or HR type of field. And again, it's a very different framework. In a large source of the problem here is that all of us in typology, whether we're doing the sort of applied use of it, we're doing more of the sort of analytical breakdown of like what's causing it. Um, we're all using the same letters, right? We're all using the MBTI 4 letters. And that, of course, becomes problematic because, you know, if you think an ISTJ is an ISTJ in all cases, under all frameworks, under all approaches, you're going to have a problem if somebody's sort of approaching it from a different framework and they come up with a different result, so to speak. And is there a good answer to that? No, not really, unless, everybody just decides to come up with their own sort of terminology and let go of the MBTI, right? Um, and but then you want to get all the YouTube hits, right? Because everybody's looking for the INFJ videos. Okay. And that, and there's enough overlap to where people sort of feel comfortable with it, that they feel like there's something there, even though there might be very distinct differences between the different approaches. Okay, so all that being said, that's sort of my sort of, I don't know, setting up the FE groundwork or diplomatic groundwork here. And but I think the larger point is, um, you know, different personalities, different people are going to want to get different things out of this, right? And it's sort of up to each of you and all of us to figure out like what makes this interesting and how is it useful, right? Um, and so I'm going to spend some time just talking about examples of different approaches to sort of paint the picture, and how, even though we're all using the same terminology and we're all sort of stemming from the Jungian functions, it's a tree with a lot of different branches, right? And some are going down, some are going up. It's just all over the place. So, and especially for those of you who might be new to all of this, this is why it could get very confusing, why the frame of reference just keeps changing, right? Because it really depends on the approach the person's taking. So let me give you sort of my background here. Let's talk about me. And it'll sort of help show why I take the approach that I take, the approach that I sort of, have adopted over the years. But it's not to say that it's the only approach, right? I mean, it's just the approach that works for me and it works for some other people. But I like the idea of different approaches and sort of attacking the problem from different angles. Now, of course, the objective realist in me sort of cringes at the idea that you could have different approaches to solving the same problem, but here we are, right? We're people and we're complicated, so we'll deal with the hand that we're dealt. Okay, so my background, back to me. So I started out in cognitive neuroscience back in undergrad and then grad school. And it was a relatively new field because fMRI machines had really just come out. ERPs had been around in the 80s, but they were starting to get more use cases and more sophisticated and just cheaper and easier to use, right? Like you had a few places in the 80s that had it, but then they had a bunch of grad students that learned the technology and they sort of flowered across the country, right? And same with the fMRI, right? When I was in grad school, I think there were only about 4, maybe, fMRI machines that were being used for research. And then people graduated out of labs and they started their own labs and they got funding. And so you started seeing fMRI machines pop up everywhere. And so the 90s was mid to late 90s and early 2000s was an interesting time because computers were getting cheaper. You had better statistical software. You had better processing power. So you could do all these like fMRI scans that at the time had like crazy amounts of memory that had to be analyzed and sorted out. And so there was this real just boom in cognitive neuroscience, and it was sort of a new discipline. And the idea was it was sort of a cross between neuroscience and psychology, where the goal was to map out the different parts of the brain that were underlying different functions, like psychological functions like memory, attention, speech, spatial processing, all that, motor movement, all that kind of stuff, right? And one of the oldest approaches is what we call the neuropsych approach. And the neuropsych approach was where you would take patients that had some sort of lesion, some sort of injury to the brain, where they had some sort of dysfunction or cognitive disability, but in a very specific domain, right? And so if you wanted to study memory in the brain, there's sort of two ways there's several ways you could do it, but if you're just studying people without fMRI machines or ERPs or anything, really the only way you could really do it is either study somebody who's got really, really good memory, like supercharged memory, like the people who can remember a phone book, those like crazy, hypermnesic people. And there certainly was a lot of that studying, in the old days, the early 1900s. And, there are a lot of theories that came out of it. But the better approach, just from a sort of scientific method approach, is to find people who have deficits in memory. So people with amnesia or maybe Alzheimer's, or Alzheimer's gets tough because it affects more than memory. But you want to find people who have very specific lesions to the brain where you can put them in an MRI machine, see where the lesion is, and it's sort of circumscribed to, a small area, right? Now, you're never going to get exactly what you want. It's going to spread out in other areas, but you want it as small as possible. So that way you could tell, okay, this person could do all this other stuff, right? They can, they know their name, they can write paragraphs, they can read stories, they can do math problems, they might even know, a foreign language or two. They could do spatial identification tasks, they can name objects, they can do executive function tasks, all sorts of different cognitive abilities they've maintained. But as soon as you leave the room and you come back 15 minutes later, they have no idea that they've ever met you, right? They just can't lay down what we would call long-term declarative memory. And so they had a very circumscribed deficit, right? So they could do everything else, but because of this very specific brain injury, they can't do memory, right? And so what that tells us is that part of the brain is responsible for the stuff that they cannot do, and it's not responsible for all the stuff that they can do, right? And so it helps you sort of map out the brain when you're looking at different patients with different lesions in different areas. This patient might have problems with spatial awareness, and this patient might have problems with generating speech or understanding speech. There's two different areas. This patient might have memory problems. This patient might have executive function problems. And you sort of map that all out. And then you also sort of couple that with what you're finding in the fMRI and the ERP data. And now you've got a pretty good idea of what the brain is doing, right? And by mapping out all the different functions, but also sort of pinpointing, okay, if you remove this part of the brain, either because of surgery or some sort of accident or some sort of virus attack or whatever, causes the injury, if that part of the brain gets removed or damaged, then they're going to lose this very specific function, right? This very specific part of their cognition, but they're not going to lose everything else. Okay. So that's always been to me, that's always sort of been the best approach, is sort of mapping out brain behavior processing. And so now sort of translate that to typology. Okay. So now we're going to keep going down memory lane here. So I got out of academia. I was, for whatever reason, decided I wanted to go to law school. So I did that. So I kind of left the academic world, but I was always still interested in personality and psychology and stuff. And so I started watching, some of the early OGs on YouTube that did, these MBTI or cognitive function videos. And I got into it, and I did all the online tests and everything. And probably the channel that really started me, and this is getting to my point about different approaches. Okay. So the first channel that I really latched on to was this old channel called NF Geeks. And it was a guy who was an ENFP. And he was also an MBTI practitioner. So he knew what he was talking about. And I think he was a professor somewhere. And he just had this channel where he would just interview NFs, right? And he not only sort of relied on the MBTI, but he also would use the David Kiersey model of the temperament, right? So the SJs, the SFs, the NTs, and the NFs. And his channel was dedicated to the NFs. So the INFJs, ENFJs, ENFPs, INFPs, right? And he would interview different NFs. And at the time, I thought it was an NT, and I was just sort of like, crashing their party, so to speak. But he would also interview some NTs and some SJs. But most of his videos were just NF videos, and he had an approach that was very similar to the MBTI, where again it's sort of this Gryffindor, Hogwarts sorting hat kind of thing. Like, which bucket do we put you in based off of various attributes, right? And it was, it's kind of like Dungeons and Dragons or those sort of games where like you build characters and you have different scores on different attributes. Like you might have like a 9 in strength and an 8 in fighting ability and a 2 in intelligence and that kind of stuff. And like all those attributes sort of add up and they sort of create your overall character, right? With all of its strengths and all of its weaknesses. And he had that kind of holistic approach, right? And he's an ENFP, so he's TI polar, right? So he didn't really break things down and try to analyze things by the functions. He'd talk about it every once in a while, but it was much more of this just sort of holistic approach, right? And he's an innie, so he's thinking sort of holistically, metaphysically, but he's also sort of all over the place. And then, he's TE, in the third function. And so it was a very just sort of practical, like, here's how NFs think about Valentine's Day, right? Here's how an ENFP would think about Christmas, and then how an INFP would think about Christmas, right? And it was just kind of this applied, but very just whimsical, didn't take itself too seriously kind of channel, right? But it did give you a very good view because he was really good at explaining sort of the holistic view of things, right? And it gave you sort of this sense of what it's like to be an NF, or a sense of what it's like to be an SJ, or a sense of what it's like to be an NT, et cetera, et cetera. And so then you just sort of develop this intuitive sense. And me and a good friend, who's also a lawyer and also a recovering psych major graduate, he and I were both real into MBTI and the Kiersey model and all that. And we would just talk about, people we worked with or clients or people we knew, and like, oh yeah, that guy's totally an SJ, and oh, that guy's totally an NT. But it was very sort of a high level at that, right? Like which Hogwarts house do they go in? And then I, started stumbling across more of the cognitive function stuff where, it's less holistic and it's more analytical. And they start breaking things down by the functions. And of course, one of the big OGs was Dave's Superpowers at the time. And then he sort of disappeared before his latest iteration. But, he was sort of the one that sort of turned me on to like, oh, there's a way to sort of break this down into the functions in a way that's different than the way Myers-Briggs had done it or even Jung had done it, right? That there's that stacking order. And there were other people popping up around then, Personality Hacker and some others. But, it never, like, it would almost be like I would watch one video and I'd learn something, and then I'd watch another video, and then what I thought I had learned in the first video is now completely upside down and backwards in the next video. And there wasn't like a coherent framework in a lot of them, and a lot of it is just because I was going from different channel to different channel, and maybe it was just me, maybe it was a me thing, not a them thing. But then I stumbled across, talking with famous people, which is, sort of the model that I'm always citing on here, and the model that, sort of to me makes the most sense given my background, because, and for those of you who haven't like watched it or anything, you should check it out, and, especially when he's breaking down the different information types, because for the first time, it was like, okay, the way that he explained the cognitive functions mapped directly onto what I knew about different parts of the brain, right? And so he thinks of functions in the way of like computational elements of a computer, right? Like, or computational functions in a computer that what your brain is doing or what your cognitive functions are doing, however you want to think about it. It's processing different types of information to achieve different types of goals, right? So a function is you get information out or information in, then the function does something to it, right? And then you get different types of information coming out of it, right? And the information that's coming in, we get lots of different types of information coming in. So you need different functional models that process that information and give different sorts of outputs. And that mapped on to the fact that you've got all these different brain modules doing different things, right? So TE roughly maps out to your prefrontal cortex, which is doing executive function work. TI roughly maps into more posterior temporal, maybe parietal lobe areas that are doing more internal logical calculations. NE probably maps towards your language generation areas. It's doing more than just generating language. It's sort of doing abstract metaphysical processing. So that's probably NE stuff. NI stuff is probably medial temporal lobe, making associations between different representations, so on and so forth. And the thing is if you actually look at the scans that Nardi has put out, speaking of Nardi, they map on pretty well to what you would expect. People who are sort of lead perceivers, right? So the IPs and the EPs, the IJs and the EPs, they tend to have more right frontal activity, which is more indicative of sort of abstract holistic thought, where your people with dominant judging, so your EJs and your IPs, right? Those of you who have like thinking or feeling as your dominant function are probably going to have more left frontal activity, and that's more concrete, analytical, discrete thinking, right? And so it maps on pretty well. And so, okay. So the thing is, going back to the approaches, is this approach is much more analytical, right? Or I don't want to say more analytical because Barron's is also very analytical. She breaks things down pretty well. But she's much more, again, sort of TE. How do you apply this knowledge in the real world or in the workplace? And how do you sort of break things down into different categories that are sort of easily digestible by people who don't think about this stuff every day, right? Like that person's a Slytherin, that person's a Gryffindor. And then they just sort of figure out what that person is, put them in their slot, and go with it, right? Now, of course, she of course goes much deeper into it. She's much more analytical. She has a very TI side of it as well, but she also understands that the TE part of it, the applied use of it, is sort of her bread and butter, right? But the talking with famous people approach and the approach that I sort of take is much more just sort of academic and analytical, right? I mean, there's some applied use to it. I certainly get a benefit out of my day-to-day activity in using it, but I don't try to go and sell it as a product, right? Or try to convince the world that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. It's more of just like, it's just sort of personal to me. It's a very INFJ TI thing, right? I'm using my TI for purely personal reasons, even though I'm kind of, sharing it out there. Okay, third function TI. All right, so now that being said, so when I go about typing people, and whether I'm right or wrong, again, I don't really have much of a dog in that fight, but it's fun to do anyways, right? I'm going to take more of the polar test approach, right? Where, again, if you're thinking of all the cognitive functions as sort of independent modules in the brain that are processing different types of information, then each of those brain areas, if it's going to be processing information, it's going to be doing two things. Number one, it's going to be attracting more blood to that part of the brain, right? So if you're doing a TE task, you're going to have more blood going to the TE part of your brain, the prefrontal cortex, and most likely the left prefrontal cortex. And so because the blood is going to that part of the brain, it's not going to other parts of the brain, so your other functions are sort of, dropping down in activity, right? Unless your TE needs to sort of use it, right? Like it needs to use some SI information or some NI information. But in general, your TE is going to be sort of hogging the spotlight if you're doing a TE type task, right? And not only that, but what you'll see in the brain is that when one area starts becoming active, it starts, actively shutting down other areas that process kind of similar information, right? So your TE part of your brain is going to actively inhibit or shut down the FE part of your brain, right? And vice versa. If you're doing an FE type of thing, you're gonna, not only are you getting all this blood and energy in your FE part of the brain, but it's also actively shutting down other parts of the brain to, so that it can sort of use up more resources, et cetera, right? And then on top of that, when when you have a really active area, you'll start seeing the neurons in that area, they start syncing up, right? They start firing together. And when they're when they're not being actively engaged, they're just sort of randomly, popping, right? But when they start doing something, some sort of function, you start seeing them blinking or, firing together. And, there's a pretty good argument that that's what consciousness is, right? When all your neurons start sort of firing in sync, nobody knows why, right? But there's some sort of emergent phenomenon that, that sort of brings whatever you're processing into consciousness. And that is what, when we say, when people talk about attention, that is what they're talking about, is dedicating the brain resources to a particular function, right? Because I got to process this information, right? I got some goal at hand. I got a TE thing I got to do. And so I need to process this information. So I need all the blood and the energy to go to that area. And then I'm also going to actively shut down everything else. And not only that, it's going to start syncing, and then it's going to bring that function into consciousness. Okay. Now, we're not all created equal. There's the 16 different types, and it could be, it's just the way you're born. It could be your early development. It could be your development throughout your life. Who knows, right? Maybe you start off as an INTJ as a baby and you grow up to be an ENFP. I have no idea, but at whatever point, you're an ENFP, your brain is going to be organized in a way where it just naturally does one or two of these functions more effortlessly than it does with the other functions, right? And it could be, you've got more connections in the neurons, you've got stronger myelin, stronger connections, who knows, right? But just one of these areas or two areas are sort of working together end up being just more dominant, right? And it takes probably fewer resources, or you just naturally have more blood going there. Who knows, right? And because of that, because of just sort of the natural trade-off you get in biology, you're going to have that area not only sort of operating more, but it's also going to be actively inhibiting its counterpart, right? So your FE is going to be actively inhibiting your TE, or your TE is going to be actively inhibiting your FE. And so if you're like an INFJ and you're an FE tool user and you're using FE constantly to sort of feed your NI intuition, your FE is constantly shutting down your TE, right? To the point to where it's just like it's hard to engage your TE. You have to spend a lot of mental energy to get that TE going. Okay. And so because of all that, right? This is my interpretation of the data and how everything works. You're gonna have that polar function, right? So if you're an INFJ, you're constantly using your FE tool function, your second function, and it's constantly sort of inhibiting your TE function, then it's going to be harder to bring your TE system online. And that is the nature of being polar, right? Or let's just say SE is your second function. You're like an ISTP. Well, I would argue that your SE system is actively shutting down your NE system, right? Like I've got to pay attention to the actual physical world, and I can't be thinking about all these different abstract ideas while I'm trying to interact in the real world, right? In the physical world. And so you could see why these systems would want to be sort of shutting each other down. And causing this sort of polar function, right? Because if you're doing it constantly through your life, then it's just going to be harder to bring that function up, your polar function. And again, it's not to say that you don't have it at all. It's not like, one of these neuropsych patients where they have actual damage to their brain and they can't do it at all, or there's a lot of static on the system. It's just harder to bring it up. And then it's just noticeable, right? It's noticeable when somebody is trying to use that particular function, and and it requires effort, right? And then on the flip side, with their dominant function or their second function, they're doing it effortlessly. Like, and again, it's just you just develop a sense of it once you start thinking about it this way. It's just like watching, LeBron James dribble a basketball, right? I mean, he just does it effortlessly. Like, compared to me, if you watch me dribble a basketball, you'd be like, okay, that requires a lot of attention and a lot of effort, right? Um, okay. So, so when you see things like Elon Musk in the middle of a New York Times interview tell the world to fuck off because he doesn't like that they're holding him ransom. That to me is an FE polar thing. I think that's like, is probably FE polar as you can get. Telling everybody that they could go to hell. Right? Now, other people could disagree. They could read it as a completely different thing or, put it into a different slot. But to me, just the way that I view things and the model and the framework that I'm working in, that's FE polar. That is not diplomatic. Okay, but maybe he was having a bad day or whatever. Okay. So, and so within this framework, right, if you're going to be looking at where is the polar function, where does this person sort of break down and require a bunch of effort, or they just sort of disregard it completely, um, then, it narrows it down to one of two types, either ISTJ or INTJ. So if I'm going to make the argument that he's FE polar, somebody could certainly make the argument that he's INTJ as opposed to ISTJ, right? And that's fine. I mean, then it's just sort of a battle of like, okay, how do the other functions stack up? And my original video, the point was just like, when you have lead intuitives like an INTJ, they're just constantly talking in analogies. They're just constantly making analogies. And you just don't see it in Elon Musk. Now, he makes some analogies because he's not NI-polar, right? But, he's not, I mean, you compare him to somebody like Duncan Trussell or somebody who's just like this crazy lead intuitive when they're on Joe Rogan, and it's just one analogy after another. Like, they can't even open their mouth without making an analogy. And not only is it an analogy, but it's like an analogy where they're connecting ideas that nobody's ever connected before, right? Sometimes for comedic effect or sometimes to sort of flesh out an abstract concept, but they're making these just random connections and these random patterns out of things that you can tell they didn't hear from somebody else, right? So just because somebody's using metaphors or similes or analogies, you sort of want to ask yourself, okay, is this something that they heard from somebody else and they're really just using this analogy through their SI, right? Like they heard it, sounded like a good analogy, and so they're just sort of repeating it, because it's a good time to bring up that analogy. Or is it somebody who's just like Duncan Trussell? Like, just watch Duncan Trussell on Joe Rogan for like 30 seconds and you'll see exactly what I mean, where they're just making analogies and making connections between things that you can tell, they're doing it on the spot and they're not just like coming at, remembering an analogy that somebody else made through their SI. Okay. So, and again, so those are really just the things that I look for. First, are they polar? And then, depending on which function we're trying to sort out, is the NI or SI? If I'm looking for NI stuff, I'm looking for, lead intuitive, I'm looking for analogies. Okay. Now, again, that's the framework I'm looking at it through. And if you look at it through Barron's framework or a general MBTI framework, maybe he comes out very differently, right? Like maybe this whole polar thing doesn't play as big of a role, in the way that they're sorting people. maybe there's something else going on, right? That's driving them to be in the NT camp or the INTJ camp or the INTP camp. But with the framework that I use, and maybe I'm wrong, I don't know, but it seems to work for me, and it seems to work for Eric. Um, then that's the way the dominoes are going to fall, right? Or the chips are going to fall. Okay, so other approaches, there's other channels out there that aren't doing this like total analytical breakdown based off of which function is getting the most resources or attention. Other people just type book. They're two lead intuitives. They're typing people. I generally agree. I might disagree on one or two, but whatever, right? I mean, they've got their own framework. It works for them. And it's just cool to watch two lead intuitives, an INTJ and an INFJ, just observe people, right? Like, to me, it's just fun to watch, right? And it also sort of it gives me more of a holistic sort of view of the personality type, where sometimes if you're breaking things down by the functions too much, you start losing the forest for the trees, right? And you might be focusing too much on this particular function, or where is this function in the stack, and sort of missing the big picture, right? And that's what a lead intuitive generally is going to be very good at, is sort of seeing the big picture, notwithstanding the fact that I tend to sort of err the other way. So maybe I'm something else, who knows? But anyways, but yeah, so and like my video earlier this week, right? They had these very like NI observations about ISFPs that I had never really, it never really occurred to me, because it's not going to emerge out of just talking about the functions, right? There's sort of this emergent property, this holistic gestalt type of property that they're tuning into, that if you're just looking at the trees, you might sort of lose sight of, and so it's interesting. And then you can take that perspective and sort of try to work it into your own, and maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but that's, again, all part of the fun of it, right? And then of course there's plenty of other methods out there, too many to name probably. But I guess the take-home message here is, it's fun to talk about what type somebody is, but also just sort of keep in mind, like, okay, maybe we're sort of looking at it from a different framework. Maybe the ISTJ and the MBTI model might be different than the ISTJ and whatever model I'm using. And but we're just sort of left to the fact that we're beholden to the fact that we're all using the same letters, right? And it causes a lot of confusion. And and if you're getting into this or have been into it, whatever framework works for you, like, go with it, right? There's plenty of flavors in the ice cream store. And again, the objective realist in me is like, is that really true? But again, we're just trying to figure out ways of dealing with people, ways of interacting with people, and sort of framing our conversation about how do we describe people, how do we understand people, getting to a point where you can understand where they're coming from, right? If you're working with an SJ, they're going to want things a certain way versus working with an SP, right? And I just see it every day, and I've seen it every day for the last 15, 20 years, right? And it just gives you a framework to think about, right? And if you're right or if you're wrong, whatever. There's no test at the like, you're not going to get to heaven and there's be like a test. Like, it's like Elon Musk, an ISTJ or an ENTJ. Nothing like that. But hopefully, it just gives you a good framework to use. And, and if you want to use Barron's framework, awesome. She's great. And it's very, good way to apply, very good way to use in an office setting. But, we might come to different conclusions. And this is true in any sort of psychological, in most sort of social sciences. I remember, we were studying the hippocampus, and everybody could agree that the hippocampus was somehow involved in memory, because if you got rid of the hippocampus, you got rid of memory, but nobody could agree on, is it spatial memory? Is it conscious memory? Is it episodic memory? Is it declarative memory? Is there some unconscious part, but mostly conscious? Is it just, like everybody had their own theory. And the thing you have to understand about academia is that nobody gets anywhere in academia unless they sort of come up with their own theory or their own interpretation of things, right? So if you're a professor and you're just regurgitating what Myers-Briggs said, for 20 years, and you're the world's expert on Myers-Briggs, nobody's going to care, right? In an academic setting, right? It's not going to get you published. It's not going to get you, tenured or professorship, because the way academia works is they want to push knowledge forward, and you have to be able to show that you've come up with some new concept, or some long-standing concept that people have accepted for 20 years is not true, or isn't as true as people thought it was. And you're just using that TI to sort of that scalpel to sort of try to further knowledge. Now, some people are better at it than others, right? So somebody like Barron's, who's very, very accomplished, she's going to come up with her own models, right? She's going to use MBTI as sort of a framework, and then sort of add layers on top of it, because that's her contribution to the field. Again, she can't just be the world's MBTI expert and leave it at that, right? At least not in academia. Okay, so you're going to see different approaches. You're going to see different people trying to pick things apart differently. Again, I have my own preference, just because that's just the way that I see it working. When you watch these typing videos on talking with famous people, as soon as it's just, to me, it's just mind-boggling when he nails a polar function. Not all of them react in the same way, but there's some functions like NI, TI, TE. He nailed me on TE. SI, when somebody's polar on it, it's just like they just drop off a cliff, right? It's like they're just chugging along doing the tests, to some degree or another. But once he hits that polar button, that polar function, like they just immediately drop off, and you just see it right away, right? If you've been watching these and you know what you're looking for. There's a really good one that came up. It was an old video, but it came up in my feed of an ENTJ, and he just kept pressing him, trying to press him on this SI, like, give me an SI answer. And the guy just didn't even understand what he was getting at, like didn't understand what he was being asked. Like, he was that SI polar. Like, he just could not, bring up like a memory of something. He just kept saying, like, yeah, when I go to the store, I usually do this. I usually do. It's like, okay, well, tell me what you did the last time you went to the store. Like, what specifically happened? Well, I usually just pick up this, and it's been a while since I've been in the store. It's probably been like 5 months. He just could not answer the SI thing. It was just so obvious to everybody, probably other than him. And so when you see that, the predictive value of the model, it just sort of rings out, right? And again, maybe he would come out differently on a standard MBTI test or any other sort of inventory, and that's fine, whatever. But again, you have to keep in mind which framework you're sort of looking at it from. Okay, enough about me. I'm going to make another video responding to another comment. But I'm getting some new viewers here, and so I just wanted to sort of share where I'm coming from, right? And and of course, everybody's welcome to comment and all of that. But this, I guess this is just my little FE way of setting up a defense of if I'm wrong about typing somebody like a Joe Rogan or an Elon Musk, it's not my fault. It's just I have a different framework. Nobody's right or wrong. It's just a different framework. All right, cool. See you on the next one. Bye.